Camera isn't really centered. Oh, that's fun. Hi, whoever just joined. I'm just testing it out. I was going to read a little bit of Lash. I don't know what platform you're on. If you can hear me okay, if you can comment, that would be sweet. See if this shows up. Or you disappeared. Let's see. Let me see here. Okay, so it doesn't look like it's picking up the audio. I have music in the background. Okay. Yeah, let's adjust this a little bit. You know, that one viewer could just be myself. There's 2 people watching. Holy smokes. All right, well, I guess I'll get started if a couple of people are watching. So my name's Andrew, and I'm just futzing around with a concept here for a stream. It seems like everyone's doing podcasts nowadays. So kind of foster debate. If you want to join and hang out, just let me know. So put a comment. I think I got this program. I'm using Streamlabs. Should be able to join. Let me double check, see if Twitter's still working. This is cool. I'm such a boomer. All right, eat. All right. So today, and so we get some interaction going. I was going to read it just for a few minutes. Culture of Narcissism, Christopher Lasch. I was reading it, and it was kind of speaking to me. So I was in the middle of reading a paragraph talking about like leaders in the movement. So like throughout history, especially in like the 1960s, what he talks about here is how people would constantly be waiting for this leader to arise as movements are disbanded. So for example, like the anti-war movement, right? Like people would say like, what was that? The movie on Netflix that just came out with the group of guys. They all got arrested in Chicago for the anti-war movement, right? And they were all trying to be thrown in jail and to stop the movement, etc. So, you know, when those leaders go away, or like Fred Hampton, for example, Malcolm, Martin Luther King, like there's a leadership void. And I feel like in this movement, we're kind of living that right now, right? Because there's no leaders that are helping us. So I thought this is just kind of poignant at this time for a test stream. Again, this one person viewing could just be myself, but here we go. Some critics have described the narcissism. Move this over a bit. Okay. Some critics have described the narcissism of the 1970s in similar language. The new therapies spawned by the human potential movement, according to Peter Martin, teach that the individual is all powerful and totally determines one's fate. Thus, they intensify the isolation of the self. This line of argument belongs to a well-established American tradition of social thought. Marin's plea for recognition of the immense middle ground of human community recalls Van Wyck books, who criticized the New England Transcendentalists for ignoring the genial middle ground of the human tradition. Brooks himself, when he formulated his own indictment of the American culture, drew on such critiques as Santayana, Henry James, Orestes Brownson, and Tocqueville. The critical tradition they established has much to tell about the evils, untrammeled individualism, but it needs to be restated to take account of the differences between 19th century atomism and the narcissism over time. Again, I'm just a guy. I'm not an academic. Don't skewer me on this. The critique of privatism, though it helps to keep alive the need for community, has become more and more misleading as the possibility of genuine privacy recedes. The contemporary American may have failed, like his predecessors, to establish any sort of common life, but the integrity and tendencies of modern industrial society have at the same time undermined his isolation, having surrendered most of his technical skills to the corporation. He can no longer provide for his material needs, as the family loses not only its productive functions, but as many of its reproductive functions as well. Men and women no longer manage even to raise their children without the help of certified experts. The atrophy of older traditions of self-help has eroded everyday competence in the area after another, and has made the individual dependent on the state, the corporation, and other bureaucracies. Narcissism represents the psychological dimension of this interdependence. Notwithstanding his occasional illusions of omnipotence, the narcissist depends on others to validate his self-esteem. He cannot live without an admiring audience. I think that's interesting, right? Because in theory, so much of our society is built on the social media platforms, and it looks like Facebook is down still today, and so that's just kind of interesting, right? Like a lot of people's mechanism to engage with other people is now gone, and it's probably a good thing, right? Make people go outside, and here I am trying to stream on some platforms. But anyways, narcissism represents this. Read all that. He cannot live without an admiring audience. His apparent freedom from family ties and institutional constraints does not free him to stand alone or glory in his individuality. On the contrary, it contributes to his insecurity, which can overcome only by seeing his grandiose self, reflected in the intentions of others, or by attaching himself to those who radiate celebrity, power, and charisma. For the narcissist, the world is a mirror, whereas the rugged individualist saw his empty wilderness to be shaped by his own design. In the 19th century American imagination, the vast continent stretching westward symbolized both the promise and the menace of the escape from the past. The West represented an opportunity to build a new society unencumbered by feudal inhibitions, but it's also tempted men to throw off civilization to revert to savagery. Dogs. Through compulsive industry and relentless sexual repression, 19th century American achieved a fragmented triumph over the id. The violence they turned against the Indians and against nature originated not in the unrestrained impulse, but in the white Anglo-Saxon superego, which feared the wildness of the West because it objectified the wilderness within each individual. While celebrating the romance of the frontier in their popular literature, in practice, Americans imposed on the wilderness a new order designed to keep impulse in check while giving free rein to acquisitiveness. Capital accumulation in its own right sublimated appetite and subordinated the pursuit of self-interest to the service of future generations. Yes, doggies. In the heat of the struggle to win the West, the American pioneer gave full vent to his rapacity and murderous cruelty, but he's always envisioned the result. not without misgivings expressed in the nostalgic cult of the loss of innocence, his peaceful, respectful, church-going community safe for his women and children. He imagined that his offspring, raised under the morally refining influence of feminine culture, would grow up to be sober, law-abiding, domesticated American citizens, and thought of the advantages that they would inherit justified his toil and excused. He thought his frequent lapses into brutality, sadism, and the R word. Today, Americans are overcome not by the sense of endless possibility, but by the banality of the social order they have been erected against. Having internalized the social restraints by means of which they formerly sought to keep possibility within civilized limits, they feel themselves overwhelmed by an annihilated boredom, like animals whose instincts have withered in captivity. That's a lot of like what Hedges talks about, where he talks about, and I tweet about this a lot too, the disintegration of our social bonds and how we fight against that all the time, and how we really need to rebuild those social bonds to kind of reclaim our humanity. A reversion to savagery threatens them to do little that they have longed precisely for a more vigorous instinctual existence. People nowadays complain of the inability to feel. They cultivate more vivid experiences, seek to beat sluggish flesh to life, attempt to revive jaded appetites. Now, that's wild because I remember a Vice article or a Vice piece on YouTube where they talked about how in sex work, especially in Manhattan with all of the bankers, they're so dead inside because they have so much wealth that they like talked about putting these bankers parts between plexiglass and smushing it. It's like so nasty, but just so they could feel something through that pain, which is kind of I think very much a reflective attitude towards the ruling elites of how they govern society. Just throw them, it's very much like the Romans, right? Put them all in the Colosseum, etc. Let them watch the sport and try to generate some sort of excitement, and it has to ratchet it up, right? So like originally you'd have like a competitive like game going on in the Colosseum, but then eventually the people get tired of that. So then you have to start chopping people's heads off. And then once they're done killing each other, well, then people get tired of that. So then you have to add, animals and wildlife and increase the spectacle, so more and more people, or to keep the people entertained. And I feel that that's kind of what's happening now as well, especially in our media. They cultivate more vivid experiences, seek to beat the sluggish flesh to life, attempt to revive jaded appetites. They condemn the superego and exalt the loss of the senses. 20th century peoples have erected so many psychological barriers against strong emotion and have invested those defenses with so much the energy derived from the forbidden impulse that they no longer can remember what it feels like to be inundated by desire. They tend rather to be consumed with rage, which derives from the defenses against desire and gives rise in turn to new defenses against rage itself. Outwardly bland, submissive, and sociable, they seethe with inner anger, for which a dense, overpopulated, bureaucratic society can devise a few legitimate outlets. The growth of bureaucracy creates an intricate network of personal relations, puts a premium on social skills, and makes unbridled egotism of the American atom unattainable. Yet at the same time, it erodes all forms of patriarchal authority and thus weakens the social superego, formerly represented by fathers, teachers, and preachers. They decline into the decline of institutionalized authority in the ostensible permissive society does not, however, lead to a decline of the superego in individuals. It encourages instead the development of a harsh, punitive superego that derives most of its psychic energy in the absence of authorities, social prohibitions from the destructive, aggressive impulses within the id. Unconscious, irrational elements in the superego come to dominate its operation. As authority figures in modern society lose their credibility, the superego in individuals increasingly derives from the child's primitive fantasies about his parents, fantasies charged with the sadistic rage rather than in a form of internalized ego ideals formed by later experience, which the love, respect, models, and social conduct. That's a lot. I think what he's getting at there is talking about how when, and I think this is going hand in hand with Hedges, the church used to kind of fulfill that role. I'm not advocating like to each his own, but the church used to kind of fill that tribalistic goal of society, and that's gone now. And so how do he call it? A super ego in individuals increasingly derives from the child's primitive fantasies about his parents, fantasies charged with sadistic rage rather than in the form of internalized ego ideals formed by later experience. So that part is repressed. So then you get the political and increased idealistic self, because like, right now with everything with the virus, people don't trust the typical sources of information. I sure as hell don't anymore. And so they believe, internalized, that they can find the answers themselves. Let's see if I got that right. The superego, society's agent in the mind, always consists of internalized representation of parents and other symbols of authority, but it is important to distinguish between the representations which derive from archaic pre-Oedipal impressions and those resting on later impressions, and therefore reflecting a more realistic assessment of parental powers. Strictly speaking, these later contribute to the formation of the ego ideal, the internalization of others' expectations and the traits we love and admire in them, whereas the superego, in distinction to the ego ideal, derives from earlier fantasies that contain a large admixture of aggression and rage, originating in the parent's inevitable failure to satisfy all the child's instinctual demands. But the aggressive, punishing, and even self-destructing part of the superego is usually modified by later experience, which softens early fantasies of parents as devouring monsters. Woof. If that experience is lacking, as is so often in society that has radically devalued all forms of authority, the sadistic superego can be expected to develop at the expense of the ego ideal, the destructive superego at the expense of the severe but salacious inner voice we all call conscience. That's pretty intense. All right, my head hurts. All right, I'm going to go for now. I think this one person is still myself. So I'm going to go double check to see how this recorded. Thanks for everyone who stopped in, and we'll take it from here. Adios.